Welcome to Lying and Cheating. Please like this video and subscribe. Lying and Cheating. A 25-year-old woman ruined Halloween and cheated on her boyfriend of 24 years. I should probably start by saying I'm pretty detail-oriented, so this might be a bit of a long read. Hopefully, it'll help you understand how everything unfolded and why things ended up the way they did. I guess I'll begin by letting you know that I'm from Houston, born and raised. I grew up in a pretty traditional Persian family, and to be honest, I've always found myself more attracted to black men. It's just a preference I've had, though I don't think too much about it. Anyway, after I finished college, I decided to leave Houston behind and move to LA. I was ready for something new, something different. LA seemed like the perfect place for that. I was craving excitement, and if there's anywhere to find it, it's LA. The vibe there is completely different, and I was loving it. I felt like I was starting a whole new chapter in my life. It was while I was living in LA that I met Daniel. He was a guy who worked at Goldman Sachs in New York, but he traveled to the West Coast for business a few times a year. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. Another Wall Street guy, probably arrogant, full of himself, and ready to flaunt his money. But Daniel was nothing like that. He wasn't your typical douchey, finance bro type. He stood about 6'3", had light skin, and let's be honest, he was ridiculously good-looking. I mean, the kind of guy who walks into a room and everyone stops for a second just to take him in. But despite his looks, what really surprised me was his personality. He was humble, like genuinely down to earth. You wouldn't expect it from someone in his position, but it was refreshing. He was from North Carolina, and his background was a lot more modest than the career he had built for himself. He grew up in a small town and had that strong, silent type of demeanor, very focused, driven, and not one to be loud about his accomplishments. But every time he did speak, it was to make you laugh. He had a quiet kind of humor, the kind that sneaks up on you and catches you off guard. I found myself drawn to that about him. We started hanging out more when he was in town, and it didn't take long before we became really great friends. But that's all we could be, at least in his eyes. He was clear from the start that since he didn't live in LA, he wasn't interested in pursuing anything serious with me. He had his life in New York, and he was so focused on his career that a long-distance relationship just wasn't something he wanted to consider. So, we settled into this strange but comfortable friendship. I think, in some ways, I hoped that maybe one day, he'd change his mind, but deep down, I knew he wouldn't. Still, I enjoyed his company and didn't mind keeping things the way they were. Fast forward to this year. I ended up moving back to Houston at the start of the year. LA was fun for a while, but after a few years, I got tired of it. The fast pace, the constant need to keep up, it wasn't really for me in the long run. Plus, I missed my family, and I figured it was time to go back home and reconnect with my roots. When I got back to Houston, I decided I needed to make some changes in my life. One of the biggest changes? My love life. I had been stuck in this cycle of dating the same type of guy over and over, and I was tired of the constant disappointment. I was tired of going after the same type of guy who never really seemed to work out for me. So, I decided to do something different. I started dating a white guy for the first time in my life. His name is Ryan, and we've been together for a few months now. He's not like any of the guys I've dated before, and in a way, that's exactly what drew me to him. He's sweet, kind-hearted, and compassionate. There's this rugged side to him, too, though. He's not afraid to get his hands dirty, and I find that really attractive. But I'd be lying if I said he wasn't almost the complete opposite of what I've always gone for. Ryan's the kind of guy who would do anything to make you happy. He's thoughtful and considerate, the type who remembers the little things and goes out of his way to show you he cares. I like him a lot. But there's always been this voice in the back of my mind, this nagging feeling that he's not the one. It's not that he's done anything wrong. In fact, he's been pretty perfect. But something just doesn't feel right, and I haven't been able to shake that feeling since we started dating. It wasn't long before my past started creeping back into my life. Around the time Ryan and I started getting serious, I got a call from my old friend Daniel. We hadn't spoken much since I moved back to Houston, but hearing his voice stirred up all these feelings I thought I had buried. He told me he was coming to Texas for work and wanted to catch up while he was in town. When we met up, all those old emotions came rushing back. We spent hours talking, just like we used to in LA. It felt like no time had passed, and that same chemistry was still there, lingering beneath the surface. I tried to keep things casual, telling myself that we were just friends, but deep down, I knew better. There was more to it than that, and I wasn't being honest with myself about how I really felt. It didn't take long for things to escalate. We had a few drinks, started reminiscing about old times, and before I knew it, one thing led to another. I don't even know how it happened. It just felt so familiar, so easy, like slipping into an old routine. And in that moment, I completely forgot about Ryan. I wasn't thinking about the consequences or how much it would hurt him. I was only thinking about how good it felt to be with someone I had always wanted but never thought I could have. The guilt didn't hit me right away. For a brief moment, I convinced myself that maybe it wasn't such a big deal. I mean, Ryan and I hadn't been together that long, and maybe this was just a sign that we weren't meant to be. But as the days went by, the weight of what I had done started to sink in. I knew I had crossed a line, and there was no going back. I tried to act normal around Ryan, pretending like everything was fine, but the guilt was eating me alive. Every time he looked at me, I felt like he could see right through me. I knew I had to tell him the truth, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I kept putting it off, hoping that somehow the situation would resolve itself. But of course it didn't. Then Halloween came around, and that's when everything fell apart. Ryan had been planning this big Halloween party for weeks. He was so excited about it, and I could tell he wanted everything to be perfect. I should have been more supportive, but I wasn't in the right headspace. I was still wrestling with my guilt, and it was making me distant. I wasn't giving him the attention he deserved, and I could tell he was starting to notice. The night of the party, things were tense between us. I tried to put on a brave face and act like I was having a good time, but inside, I was a mess. Ryan could tell something was off, and he kept asking me if I was okay. I kept brushing him off, telling him I was fine, but he didn't believe me. Eventually, he pulled me aside and asked me point-blank what was going on. That's when I lost it. The guilt, the stress, everything came pouring out all at once. I told him everything. I told him about Daniel, about how we had hooked up, and how I had been hiding it from him. The look on his face when I told him, it was like I had punched him in the gut. I could see the hurt in his eyes, and it broke me. Ryan didn't say much after that. He just nodded, turned around, and walked out of the party. I stood there, watching him go, feeling like the worst person in the world. The party went on around me, but I couldn't hear any of it. All I could think about was how I had ruined everything. I had hurt the one person who had been nothing but good to me, and for what? For a guy who was never going to be anything more than a fleeting moment in my life. That night, I learned the hard way that actions have consequences. I had to face the reality that I wasn't as good a person as I thought I was, and that maybe I had a lot more growing up to do than I realized. I had been planning a trip to LA for Halloween for a while now. It wasn't the most well-thought-out decision, more of a spontaneous idea that I latched onto because I needed a break. The routine back in Houston was starting to get to me, and I figured there was no better way to shake things up than spending Halloween in a city that knows how to go all out for it. Ryan didn't really want to come along, though. He's not into the whole party scene, and big events like that just aren't his thing. So, I ended up making the trip with two of my girlfriends instead. When we landed in LA, everything seemed to fall into place effortlessly. The city was electric with Halloween vibes. Everywhere you looked, people were in costumes, the streets were packed with excitement. It felt like the whole place had transformed into one giant Halloween festival. The energy was contagious, and I found myself getting swept up in it. We had made plans to go to a house party up in the hills, one of those invite-only deals that sounded way too good to pass up. What I didn't know at the time, though, was that the party was being thrown by none other than Daniel, my old friend from LA. I swear, I had no clue. He's always been the type to keep things low-key, so his name wasn't attached to anything related to the event. In fact, we hadn't spoken in quite a while, so I had no idea how much he had achieved in the time we'd been out of touch. Turns out, he was doing incredibly well for himself. He had a net worth of a few $1 million now, and he was only 27. The guy had rented out this massive mansion in the hills just for the party, and the moment we arrived, I realized this was going to be one of those unforgettable nights. The party was wild. Imagine the craziest Hollywood bash you've ever seen. The The kind where everyone is dressed to the nines, the drinks are flowing, and the music is pounding so loud you can feel it in your bones. That was the kind of vibe we walked into. It was the type of scene where you could easily lose track of time, surrounded by a sea of people all trying to outdo each other with their costumes and their energy. I was excited to be there, but didn't expect the night to take the turn it did. I was making my way through the crowd when I spotted Daniel. At first, I couldn't believe my eyes. I hadn't seen him in so long, and there he was, right in front of me. We did the usual catching up thing, but it didn't take long for things to slip right back into that familiar, comfortable rhythm we used to have. It was almost like no time had passed at all. He was still the same Daniel I remembered. Charming, funny, and easy to talk to. It felt good being around him again, and before I knew it, we were laughing and reminiscing about the old days. As the night went on, the party got wilder, but I found myself glued to Daniel. We danced, we laughed, and the flirtation started to creep back in. It wasn't anything too serious at first, just harmless fun. But as we spent more time together, things started to get a little more inappropriate. We didn't cross any major lines, but there were moments when I could feel that old tension between us, unspoken, but very much there. It was almost like we were picking up where we had left off, and it felt exciting and dangerous at the same time. By the end of the night, the party had started to wind down. People were leaving in small groups, and the energy was beginning to die out. Daniel came over to say his goodbyes, but before he left, he told me he wanted to treat me and my friends to dinner the next day. I agreed, and we hugged before he made his way out. At that point, my girlfriends were getting cozy with a couple of guys they had met at the party, and it became clear that they were about to take things to the next level. They were on their way out too, heading off with these guys, which left me standing there, completely alone. I wasn't sure what to do. I didn't have a ride back to my hotel, and I didn't exactly want to walk out of the party by myself. That's when I decided to call Daniel. I let him know that my friends had ditched me, and I was basically stranded. Lucky for me, he hadn't gotten far. He came back to pick me up, and since his place was a lot closer than my hotel, I figured I'd just crash at his for the night. When we got to his place, it was as impressive as I remembered, maybe even more so. He handed me a pair of basketball shorts and a t-shirt to change into, and we hung out for a while, talking and flirting a little, but nothing too serious. It felt nice, being there with him. I was comfortable, and for a brief moment, I felt like maybe things could be simple between us again. But I knew better. There was too much history there, too many unresolved feelings. After a bit of talking, Daniel showed me to his guest bedroom. He gave me a phone charger, kissed me on the cheek, and left the room. It was a small gesture, but it meant a lot. It was his way of keeping things respectful, of not crossing any lines. I appreciated that. I crawled into bed, feeling a mix of emotions. On the one hand, I was relieved that nothing happened, but on the other hand, I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe I wanted something to happen. I tried to push those thoughts aside and just go to sleep, but my mind was racing. What was I doing? I had Ryan back home, a guy who treated me so well, and yet here I was, tangled up in old feelings for someone who had always been just out of reach. It wasn't fair to Ryan, and it wasn't fair to myself. But at the same time, I couldn't help how I felt. There was something about Daniel that kept pulling me back in, no matter how hard I tried to move on. The next morning, I woke up feeling a little uneasy. Daniel was already up, making coffee in the kitchen when I wandered out. We didn't talk much about the night before. He offered to drive me back to my hotel, and I accepted. The ride was quiet, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of guilt creeping in. I hadn't done anything wrong, technically, but I knew that emotionally, I was walking a dangerous line. When I got back to my hotel, my girlfriends were already there, laughing and recounting the wild night they had. I forced myself to join in, but my mind was elsewhere. I couldn't stop thinking about Daniel and the fact that I had let myself get so close to crossing a line. Part of me wanted to just forget the whole thing, pretend like it never happened. But another part of me knew that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. That night, as I lay in bed, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Daniel, asking if I wanted to grab dinner the next night. I hesitated for a moment, my thumb hovering over the screen. I knew I shouldn't. I knew it would only complicate things more. But I couldn't resist. Before I knew it, I had typed out a response, "Sure, Let's do it. Something about that kiss. So simple, yet it drove me wild. I waited for it to pass, hoping that after 20 minutes or so, the feeling would fade away. But it didn't. It only grew stronger, like a magnet pulling me towards something I knew I shouldn't want. I tried to fight it off, convincing myself I could just go back to sleep. But my thoughts wouldn't let go of how I felt, the lingering sensation on my cheek, and that moment of softness that stirred something dangerous inside me. Eventually, I gave in. I got up and padded quietly down the hallway toward Daniel's room. His dog stirred, growling softly at the sound of my footsteps, and I hesitated for just a second before pushing the door open. Daniel turned over in bed, his face illuminated by the dim light filtering through the window, and the instant our eyes met, it was on. Something snapped in me. I was like a woman possessed, completely out of control. All the restraint, all the rational thoughts, gone. It was reckless and wild. A decision that I knew I would regret the second it was over, but at that moment, I didn't care. He was perfect. Too perfect. I hated that about him. Hated how flawless he seemed. How he could break through every defense I put up just by being himself. I didn't want to admit it, but I was mad at myself for not letting this happen sooner. His body felt like something out of a dream, and everything about him, from his strength to the way he held me, drove me further into that madness. He took control like he knew this was our last chance, as if there was no tomorrow. It was primal, intense, and more than I ever expected. For a moment, I lost myself completely. The next morning, I woke up feeling the weight of it all. A text from Ryan blinked on my phone screen, unread. And another message from Daniel was waiting too. I didn't have the nerve to check Ryan's yet. Daniel, on the other hand, left a different kind of note. He told me there was Advil and water waiting on the nightstand, a toothbrush set out in the bathroom, and breakfast ready in the kitchen. Who even does that? He was everything I shouldn't want but couldn't resist. And before I could talk myself out of it, we had one more round, this time on the couch. I went through the motions, skipping over all the messy details, and by the time I made it back home, the guilt had settled in. My mind was swirling with questions. What should I do? Should I tell Ryan? Should I just bury this and move on? I liked Ryan, really liked him, but how could I ignore what had happened with Daniel? And the worst part was that Daniel was upset. He had no idea I had a boyfriend. When I finally told him, he was furious, saying he never would have let things go that far if he knew. And now I was tangled up in something I couldn't easily undo. But as I sat there, staring at my phone, I started to feel a gnawing unease. Something wasn't right. The conversation with Daniel had a strange tone, as if he wasn't just upset about the situation but hiding something more. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was holding back, not telling me the full truth. It was unlike him, this sudden coldness. He was usually so carefree and easygoing, but now there was something else, something darker. Days passed, and I tried to pretend like nothing had happened, but it wasn't that simple. The guilt was eating away at me, and Daniel had gone silent. No texts, no calls. At first, I thought he was giving me space, but as time went on, I started to get worried. When I finally called him, his number was disconnected. His social media profiles were gone, wiped clean. It was like he'd vanished into thin air. That's when the paranoia set in. I started wondering if maybe he wasn't as innocent as I thought. Maybe there was more to Daniel than I ever knew. He had always been so secretive, so private. How could someone worth millions just disappear like that? And why? My mind kept spinning with possibilities, each one darker than the last. Was this some kind of punishment for what we did? Or was he involved in something far more dangerous than I ever realized? One night, as I was lying in bed, my phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. My heart pounded as I opened the message. I thought you knew what you were getting into. This isn't over. We'll talk soon. I dropped the phone, my hands shaking. Who was this? Was it Daniel? Or someone else? My mind raced with questions, and suddenly, everything felt like it was spiraling out of control. I couldn't tell Ryan, couldn't let him get dragged into whatever this was, but I couldn't face it alone either. I stared at the screen, the message burning into my mind. One thing was clear. I wasn't just dealing with the fallout of a one-night mistake anymore. Something far more dangerous was lurking in the shadows, and now I was trapped. The end wasn't just about what happened with Daniel. It was only the beginning of something much bigger, and I wasn't sure if I was ready for what was coming next.